Some folks believe a home is a thing you build with timber and nails, a sturdy roof to keep out the rain, and four walls to hold the warmth in. They measure its worth in the tightness of its joints and the straightness of its lines. But I've lived long enough to know that's not the whole of it. A house is just a box for holding things. A home is something else entirely. It's a quieter construction, built not of wood, but of moments, of the silence after a shared meal, the sound of a familiar footstep on the porch, the space one person leaves for another at the table. You can't build it with a hammer. You build it with patience. This is a story for anyone who has ever felt the cold draft of loneliness in a house full of rooms. It's about a man who believed he could wall off his own heart, and a woman who arrived with nothing but the quiet strength to wait for the storm to pass. Her name was Ruth Calloway, and this story begins, as so many did in those days, with a rejection. Not the loud, slamming door kind, but a quiet, administrative sort of refusal that chills you right to the bone. It came in the form of a man standing on a train platform in Copper Creek, Montana, in the spring of 1883. He held his hat in his hands, but his gaze was as level and ungiving as the horizon. He was Caleb Ross, the man whose advertisement she had answered, the man whose name was on the letter that had brought her 2,000 miles from the soot-stained familiarity of Philadelphia. He was to be her husband, but the man who stood before her looked less like a groom and more like a man come to claim a piece of freight. He didn't build a home to share, you see. He built it to contain a loss, and he had no intention of letting anyone else in. This is the story of how the sky itself decided to tear the roof off his careful solitude, proving that the strongest walls are no match for a Montana storm and a woman with nothing left to lose. The air in Copper Creek tasted of dust and pine, and the metallic tang of the rails still cooling under the vast, indifferent sky. Ruth Calloway stepped down from the passenger car, her hand steady on the rail, her body braced for the unfamiliar ground. She wore a simple gray traveling dress, well made, but showing the faint sheen of long wear, and her hat was pinned with a determination that suggested it had weathered more than its share of wind. In her left hand, she carried a single, scuffed leather valise. It was not heavy with belongings, but with the entire compressed weight of a life left behind. Everything she owned was in that bag, save for the clothes on her back and a return ticket she had no intention of ever using. Philadelphia, with its crowded streets and the fresh grief of her father's passing, was a ghost she had paid the railroad to outrun. He was waiting, just as the letter promised. Caleb Ross. He was taller than she'd imagined, with shoulders that spoke of a life spent lifting and hauling. His face was weathered by sun and wind into a map of quiet hardship, his eyes the color of a winter sky, holding a distance that seemed to stretch as far as the plains around them. He did not smile. He did not step forward to help with her bag. He simply watched her approach, his hat held respectfully in his hands, his posture as rigid as a fence post. "Miss Calloway," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. It wasn't unkind, but it was devoid of warmth, a statement of fact. "Mr. Ross," she replied, her own voice steady, betraying none of the frantic hope that had fluttered in her chest for the last 4 days on the train. She set her valise down beside her, the small thud swallowed by the immense silence of the place. He finally seemed to register the bag. With a slight, almost reluctant motion, he reached down and took the handle. "The wagon's this way." The journey to his ranch was conducted in a near-complete silence, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the jingle of the harness. Ruth sat straight-backed on the hard wooden seat, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse of rolling grassland and the distant, jagged teeth of the mountains. She had expected questions about her journey, about her life in the East, about the skills she'd listed in her letter. She had rehearsed the answers, but he asked nothing. He simply drove, his profile set against the horizon, a man carved from the very landscape he inhabited. He seemed a part of the vast, lonely quiet. When they finally crested a rise and she saw the ranch for the first time, a small, sturdy cabin and a large barn nestled in a shallow valley, a knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. It was neat, orderly, and utterly solitary. It looked like a place a man would build if he wanted to be left alone, and as he pulled the wagon to a halt before the cabin, she had the sinking feeling that her arrival was not a welcome addition, but a necessary, and perhaps regrettable, complication. He led her inside the cabin, the scent of wood smoke and clean pine greeting her at the door. The main room was a kitchen and living space combined, dominated by a large cast-iron stove and a simple wooden table with 2 chairs. Everything was scrubbed clean, functional, and stark. A rifle rested on pegs above the door. There were no pictures on the walls, no curtains in the windows, no softness anywhere. It was the living space of a man who did not live so much as he operated. "The stove draws well," he said, gesturing toward it. "The well is out back. I keep the wood box full." He spoke as if giving instructions to a hired hand. Ruth nodded, her gaze taking in the spareness of the room. "It's very tidy." He didn't acknowledge the comment. Instead, he led her down a short, narrow hallway. He stopped at the first door on the right. "This will be your room." He pushed it open. It was small, containing a narrow bed with a simple quilt, a small dresser, and a single window that looked out onto the endless plains. It was as impersonal as a room in a boarding house. She stepped inside, her heart sinking with each footfall. She placed her hand on the cool wood of the dresser. "Thank you." He remained in the doorway, his large frame seeming to block out the light. He cleared his throat, and the sound was unnervously loud in the quiet house. "Miss Calloway," he began, and she turned to face him, sensing that the true terms of her arrival were about to be laid bare. "I want to be clear about the nature of this arrangement." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the cold distance. It was a flicker of old, banked pain. "This is a partnership," he said, his voice flat and deliberate. "For the running of this ranch, you'll have your duties in the house and I'll have mine in the fields. We'll take our meals together for efficiency. But this is a marriage in name only. It's a legal convenience to satisfy the terms of the land grant." He paused, and his next words landed like stones. "We will have separate rooms, no exceptions." He gestured with his chin toward the end of the hall to another closed door. "That is my room. This is yours. The arrangement is permanent." It was a rejection more profound than being left at the station. He had brought her 2,000 miles to tell her, face to face, that she was to be a function, not a person, a housekeeper with a wedding ring. Ruth felt a cold wave of humiliation wash over her, but she held it back, locking it down behind the composure she had spent a lifetime perfecting. She would not weep. She would not plead. She met his gaze and gave a single sharp nod. "I understand, Mr. Ross." His expression didn't change. Perhaps he had expected tears or anger. Her quiet acceptance seemed to leave him with nothing more to say. He simply nodded in return. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything." He turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floorboards, leaving her alone in the small, cold room that was to be her new life. She stood motionless for a long time, listening until the sound of his footsteps faded. Then she walked to her valise, unfastened the latches, and began to unpack. The first thing she took out was a small, silver-backed hand mirror, its surface worn smooth with the touch of her mother's hands. She placed it on the dresser, a solitary gleam of softness in the stark, unyielding room. The next morning, the house was silent when Ruth awoke. The sun was just beginning to spill pale light over the eastern plains, and for a moment, disoriented, she thought she was back in her small room in Philadelphia. Then the sheer quiet of the place settled over her, a silence so profound it seemed to have weight. She dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen. Caleb was already gone. There was no sign he had even been there, except for two things. Beside the big cast-iron stove, the wood box, which had been half full the night before, was now neatly stacked to the brim with freshly split kindling and logs. And beside the sink, a bucket of water, drawn from the well, was full to the brim. Not a drop spilled on the floor around it. He had rejected her company, but he had not neglected her needs. It was a strange, contradictory kindness. He was providing for her, making her life functional, even as he walled himself off from her presence. He was the man who had drawn a line down the center of their lives. But he was also the man who ensured she would not have to go out into the cold morning to haul her own wood and water. He was a puzzle, a man of hard edges and hidden practical considerations. Ruth ran her hand over the smooth, cut surface of a piece of kindling. It was cut smaller than the logs she'd seen for the main hearth in other houses, sized perfectly for the quicker, hotter fire of a kitchen stove. He had thought of that. She set about her first day in her new role. She learned the quirks of the stove, the way the damper needed to be angled just so. She found the coffee, the flour, the salt, all stored in neat tins on a high shelf. There was a logic to the kitchen, a system born of one person's habits. She made coffee and a small breakfast of oatmeal for herself, eating at the table in the profound silence. From the window, she could see him, a distant figure moving with relentless purpose in a far pasture, mending a line of fence. He did not look toward the house. As she cleaned, she began to understand the nature of the man she had married. There was no clutter because he seemed to own nothing that was not essential. His few books on a shelf were practical manuals on animal husbandry and crop rotation. The single blanket on his bed, which she saw when she briefly peered into his room, the door left slightly ajar, was a coarse wool army issue, neatly folded. He had organized his life around necessity, stripping it of any comfort or sentiment. And yet, she found a small, intricately carved wooden bird tucked away on the highest shelf of the pantry, almost out of sight. It was smooth and worn, as if it had been held 1,000 times. A crack in the fortress, a clue to the hidden man behind the wall of grief he wore like a second skin. He was not cruel. He was meticulously, painfully guarded. His intervention in her life was not to offer warmth, but to offer a stark, ordered safety. It was not what she had hoped for, but as the day wore on, she realized it was more than she'd had a right to expect. It was a place to be, the arrangement settled into a rhythm, as stark and predictable as the rising and setting of the Montana sun. It was a life built on a foundation of unspoken rules and separate spaces. Ruth's domain was the house. She rose before dawn, lit the stove, and put the coffee on to boil. Caleb's domain was everything beyond the front door. He would enter the kitchen just as the coffee was ready, his face still etched with the chill of the morning air. He would take the mug she had set out for him, murmur a low, "Mornin'," and drink it standing by the window, looking out at the land he was about to go tame for the day. He was a man in constant motion, his work a bulwark against stillness. Their conversations were transactions of information. "We're low on flour," she would say, and the next Friday morning, a small cloth pouch with coins would be sitting on the corner of the table. "A storm's coming from the west," he would announce, and she would make sure the shutters were latched tight. They spoke of the price of beef in Miles City, of a coyote getting too bold near the chickens, of the need to order new canning jars before the garden came in. They never spoke of Philadelphia. They never spoke of his past. They were two people sharing a roof, but not a life, each orbiting the other in a carefully maintained distance. Ruth, for her part, accepted the terms with a quiet pragmatism that was its own form of strength. She had come west for survival, not for romance. This silent, functional existence was a harbor, however cold. She began to impose her own small order on the house. She scrubbed the floors until the pine boards gleamed. She found a patch of earth near the back door that caught the morning sun and started a small herb garden, planting the few precious seeds she had carried with her in a twist of paper. Rosemary, thyme, sage, the scents of a life she had once known, now taking root in this new, hard soil. Caleb noticed. She knew he did. One afternoon, she saw him from the kitchen window, standing near the small plot, his head angled as he looked at the tender green shoots. He did not say a word about it when he came in for supper, but the next day, a low fence of woven willow branches had been erected around the garden, just high enough to keep out rabbits. He had built it without being asked, another silent, practical gesture that spoke louder than any words he withheld. She claimed the kitchen, slowly transforming it from his Spartan workspace into a place of warmth. She baked bread twice a week, and the smell filled the small cabin, a scent of home that seemed to push back against the emptiness. He never commented on the bread, but he ate every slice she put on his plate. The arrangement was clear. He would provide the structure, the safety, the raw materials of their life, and she would provide the small, civilizing touches that made the structure habitable. It was a partnership, just as he had said. A business of living. And in the vast, lonely quiet of the Montana plains, it was, for now, enough. The days bled into weeks, and the quiet cohabitation became a language all its own, spoken in deeds, not words. The romance of their life was not in whispered secrets or lingering glances, but in the steady accumulation of small, unspoken acts of care. It was a love story written in the margins of a business arrangement. She learned that he took his coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon, and she made sure the pot was always brewing with a fierce, dark aroma when he came in from the cold. He, in turn, noticed that she shivered sometimes in the drafty kitchen on cool mornings. A few days later, a heavy woolen shawl, new from the mercantile, appeared folded neatly on her chair at the breakfast table. There was no note, no explanation. It was simply there. She took to mending his work clothes, her stitches small and even, a line of careful thread closing a tear in a shirt sleeve or reinforcing a seam on his heavy canvas coat. She found a satisfaction in the simple, useful act, in making something whole again. He would come home late from the fields, long after dusk, to find his dinner waiting on the back of the stove, kept warm and a single lamp left burning on the kitchen table, a small beacon in the immense darkness. He never thanked her for it, but he also never failed to clean his plate. One morning, she came into the kitchen to find a single, startlingly blue wildflower sitting in a glass of water on the table. It was a prairie crocus, a sign of early spring. She touched one of its delicate, fuzzy petals, her heart giving a strange, unfamiliar leap. The next week, it was a spray of yellow bellflowers. He never said where he found them or why he brought them inside. They just appeared, small, silent offerings left on the table before he departed into the dawn. She never asked. To ask would be to break the spell, to demand an explanation for something that was more beautiful for being unspoken. I've often thought that this is how true affection begins, not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet drip of steady consideration. He thought he was merely being decent, fulfilling his end of a bargain. She thought she was simply earning her keep, making herself useful. Neither of them understood that they were weaving the threads of their two solitary lives together, one silent gesture at a time. He never started his supper until she had sat down across from him. She made sure there was always a jar of pickled beets in the pantry, because she'd noticed he favored them. He thought he had built a fortress to keep the world out, but he hadn't accounted for the quiet, persistent way a woman could lay siege to it, with nothing more than warm bread, mended shirts, and a pot of coffee kept hot against his return. The silence between them was still there, But it was changing. It was no longer an empty, echoing void. It was becoming a comfortable quiet, filled with the low hum of shared existence. The first crack in Caleb's formidable wall appeared on a moonless night in late April. A low wind soughed around the corners of the cabin, a lonely, keening sound that made the lamplight flicker. Ruth was in her room, brushing out her hair, the silver-backed mirror in her hand, when she heard it. A sound from down the hall, from behind his closed door. It was a cry, thick with sleep and choked with a pain so raw it stole the breath from her lungs, and then a name, spoken into the darkness like a prayer and a curse. Sarah. The name hung in the air of the small house, an invisible ghost. Ruth froze, her hand still in her hair. So that was it. That was the source of the vast, guarded emptiness in him. His grief had a name. She heard the scrape of a match, saw the flicker of light from under his door, then heard the muffled sound of a man pacing a small, enclosed space. She stayed in her room, her heart aching with a sorrow that was not her own. The wall between their rooms suddenly felt thin, porous. She had heard something not meant for her, a piece of his locked-away heart. The next morning, he was even more remote than usual. The space around him seemed to crackle with a renewed, flinty distance. He drank his coffee without a word, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on some point far beyond the window. He looked like a man who had wrestled with ghosts all night and lost. Ruth said nothing. She simply set his breakfast before him and took her own seat. But something had shifted between them. His carefully constructed solitude was no longer impenetrable. She had seen the wound he carried. A week later, the crack deepened. He stumbled in from the fields in the middle of the afternoon, a rare event. His left hand was wrapped in a blood-soaked rag. Ruth looked up from her mending, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Clumsy," he growled, more at himself than at her, as he fumbled at the knot with his good hand. Post-hole digger slipped. Without a word, she stood up, took a clean bowl from the shelf, and filled it with warm water from the kettle. She gestured to the chair. "Sit." He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then did as he was told. He held out his hand, and she gently unwrapped the rag. The gash across his palm was deep and angry, bleeding sluggishly. Her touch was steady and impersonal as she washed the wound, her fingers moving with a practiced calm she hadn't known she possessed. She cleaned away the dirt and blood, her focus absolute. He was utterly still, his eyes not on his wound, but on her face, on the concentration in her brow. When the cut was clean, she dried the skin around it and bound it tightly with a strip of clean linen. Throughout it all, he did not flinch or pull away. He simply watched her. As she tied the final knot, his gaze was so intense it was like a physical touch. For the first time since she had arrived, he didn't look away when she met his eyes. The air in the kitchen was thick and still. "Thank you, Ruth," he said. His voice was rough, low. Hearing her given name in his mouth was a shock, as startling as a shout in a library. It was the first time he had used it. It acknowledged her as more than Miss Calloway, the housekeeper. It acknowledged her. She simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and began to clean up the bowl and the bloody rag. The crack in the wall had just become a fissure, and for the first time, a sliver of light was shining through. The storm had been threatening for days, a sullen purple bruise on the western horizon. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on Ruth's arms stand on end. Caleb had spent 2 days securing anything that could be torn loose by the wind, his movements tight with a grim, focused urgency. He checked the barn roof, reinforced the chicken coop, and hammered new leather hinges on the shutters. He worked with the grim determination of a man preparing for a known enemy. This was more than just a spring squall. it was a reckoning. The evening it finally broke. The sky turned a ghastly shade of green-gray. The wind began to moan, a low prelude to the violence to come. Ruth had finished the supper dishes and was lighting the main kerosene lamp in the kitchen when the first fat drops of rain hit the roof, sounding like scattered pebbles. Within minutes, the pebbles became a roar, a solid sheet of water driven almost horizontally by a gale that shrieked around the corners of the cabin. Thunder cracked overhead, not as a distant rumble but as a sharp, explosive report that shook the very foundations of the house. Caleb burst through the door, bringing a swirl of wind and rain with him. He was soaked to the skin, his hair plastered to his forehead, his face grim. "It's a bad one," he yelled over the din. "Barn's holding, but just barely." He slammed the door shut and slid the heavy bolt into place, sealing them inside. The small cabin felt like a ship tossed on a furious sea. The noise was constant, a deafening symphony of roaring wind and drumming rain. And then, above it all, came a new sound. A high-pitched, groaning shriek of tortured wood, followed by a deafening crash that seemed to come from the back of the house. It was the sound of the world tearing itself in half. The kitchen lamp flickered violently, and for a heart-stopping second, the room was plunged into darkness before the flame caught again. A blast of cold, wet air rushed down the short hallway. Caleb's head snapped up, his eyes wide with alarm. He grabbed the lamp and strode down the hall, Ruth close behind him. The sight that met them was one of pure devastation. The roof over the back half of the cabin, over his bedroom and her own, was simply gone. A jagged hole gaped open to the tumultuous black sky. Rain and wind poured through the opening, turning the hallway into a river. Her bed was already soaked, the quilt dark with water. His room was in even worse shape, the wind tearing at the exposed rafters. The only part of the house still intact, still dry, was the kitchen they had just left. Its sturdy lower roof had held. Caleb stood frozen for a long moment, the lamplight casting his shadow long and distorted against the scene of destruction. He looked from the gaping hole in his home to Ruth, who stood beside him, her face pale but composed. His expression was a mask of utter exhaustion and bleak, raw defeat. The storm hadn't just taken his roof, it had breached his fortress, tearing away the very structure of his solitude. He lowered the lamp, his shoulders slumping. "She died in a storm," he said, his voice so low Ruth almost didn't hear him over the gale. He didn't look at her, but at the wreckage of his room. "Sarah, my wife, a storm just like this one." The confession, ripped from him by the violence of the night, hung between them, more powerful than the thunder outside. The walls had finally come down. They retreated to the kitchen, the only sanctuary left to them. Caleb placed the lamp on the center of the table, its golden light pushing back the shadows, creating a small, intimate island in the heart of the storm's fury. Outside, the wind howled, a relentless, wild grief. Inside, a different kind of quiet settled, one thick with things finally brought into the light. The destruction of the house had stripped away the pretense of their arrangement, leaving them with nothing but the truth. He sat down heavily in his chair, running a hand through his wet hair. He looked not at the damage, but at his own hands, resting on the table. "It was 3 years ago," he began, his voice rough. "Down by the creek. A flash flood. She was trying to get the new lambs to higher ground. I told her to wait, that I'd do it. But she was never one for waiting." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a flicker of memory so painful it was hard to watch. "By the time I got there, it was too late." He fell silent, the roar of the storm filling the space his words had left. Ruth sat opposite him, her hands clasped in her lap, her presence a steady, quiet anchor. She did not offer empty platitudes. She simply listened, giving him the space his grief required. "I built this house for her," he continued, his gaze lifting to meet hers. The distance was gone from his eyes, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability. Every log, every nail, it was supposed to be our life. When she was gone, the house was just an empty shell. So I walled it off. I walled me off. I figured if I never let anyone get close again, I couldn't lose them. The separate rooms. It wasn't about you, Ruth. It was about me. A promise I made to myself, to never risk that kind of hurt again. He had laid his broken heart on the table between them. Now, it was her turn. The lamplight softened the lines of her face as she leaned forward slightly. "I didn't come here seeking love, Caleb," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I came here because I had nothing else. My father, he lost everything. Our home, his business. The shame of it killed him. One day I had a life, a future. The next I was an orphan with a handful of dollars and a name nobody in Philadelphia wanted to be associated with." She looked down at her own hands, seeing not the capable hands of a rancher's wife, but the hands of a girl who had once played piano. "I came here because I was unwanted. I didn't expect to be chosen. I just hoped to be useful." Their stories of loss and loneliness met in the small circle of light. Two solitary souls, stripped bare by the storm. He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as the woman from the advertisement, not as a housekeeper, but as a person who understood the anatomy of grief as well as he did. Slowly, he reached his hand across the table. It was the hand she had bandaged, the faint line of the scar visible in the lamplight. He didn't take her hand, but simply laid his over hers where they rested on the table. The contact was electric, a current of warmth against the cold dread of the storm. "The storm took the roof," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble beneath the wind's shriek. "Maybe it's time to let it take the walls, too." He finally looked directly at her, his winter sky eyes holding hers. "I'm not asking you to replace her, Ruth. No one could. I'm asking you to stay, to build something new with me. Here." He paused, and his next words were the choice, the final tearing down of the barrier between them. "As my wife, in my room, our room." He didn't wait for an answer. He just kept his hand over hers, a silent, patient offering in the heart of the storm. And in the quiet space between the thunderclaps, Ruth slowly, deliberately, turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. By dawn, the storm had passed. The wind died down to a whisper, and the rain softened to a gentle patter before ceasing altogether. The silence that followed was immense, a clean, washed quiet that felt like a new beginning. In the kitchen, the lamp had burned low, its flame a pale yellow against the gray light of morning. Caleb and Ruth sat at the table, their hands still loosely clasped, having talked through the night until words were no longer necessary. They had weathered the storm, both outside and in, and had come through to the other side, together. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the world. The sky was scrubbed clean, a pale, hopeful blue. The ground was saturated, glittering with moisture, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. The damage to the house was stark in the morning light, a raw, gaping wound. But looking at it, Ruth didn't feel despair. She felt a quiet, steady resolve. It was not an ending. It was a clearing of ground. That is the thing about foundations. Sometimes the structure you build on them is wrong. Sometimes you have to tear it all down, right to the studs, before you can build it back right. Caleb Ross had built a house to hold a ghost, a monument to what he had lost. The storm, in its terrible wisdom, had simply removed the part of the house that was dedicated to the past, leaving only the part where a new life had quietly, stubbornly taken root. The kitchen, the heart of the home. They rebuilt the roof together. In the days that followed, Caleb worked with a purpose Ruth had not seen before. It was no longer the relentless, solitary motion of a man running from his thoughts, but the focused, hopeful labor of a man building a future. She worked alongside him, handing him nails, fetching him tools, holding timbers steady. They worked in a comfortable, easy silence, punctuated by shared smiles and brief, practical conversations. The door to his old room was repaired. The door to her old room was repaired, but the invisible wall in the hallway was gone forever. One evening, after a long day of hammering shingles, he came to the door of her room, where she was putting her things in order. He didn't say a word. He just took her hand, led her down the hall to his room, and began moving her small dresser against the wall opposite his own. Their room. A home, you see, is not about the number of rooms. It's about the willingness to share the space you have. It's built of small acts of courage. The courage to mend a coat, to leave a wildflower on a table, to sit with someone in the dark and tell the truth. It's about the quiet choice to let someone in, even when you're terrified of what you might lose. Caleb and Ruth learned that the hard way, in the heart of a Montana gale. They learned that a house is just wood and nails, but a home is a shelter two people build for each other. So if you've ever sat in a room and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, if you've ever built a wall and wondered what it would be like to tear it down, well, this story is for you. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story meant something to you, feel free to subscribe and maybe leave a comment to let us all know where you're listening from. It's a good thing to be reminded that none of us are ever truly alone in the quiet.